So what I was just showing you was just how the interest rates follow the repo rate. And you can also look over here at these are the interest rates that banks pay on their different types of accounts, whether they're call accounts or check accounts or savings accounts. And you can see here the dark blue line, the repo again, is sitting at the top here. Then you have something called the SABOR, which is the South African Bank Overnight Rate. So this is the rate at which banks lend to each other. So you can see that the rates at which they lend to each other basically look exactly the same as the repo rate. And then you get the interest rates that the banks pay on deposits. And all those interest rates then sit below the repo rate. My interest is in why this check account line doesn't look much like the repo line. Okay, so you can see that there is a transmission mechanism, and it goes not only through banks but also through markets. Then we have an exchange rate transmission channel, and we'll talk more about that tomorrow. But essentially, the exchange rate responds to changes in the interest rates in South Africa relative to the interest rates in other countries. We call that the South African interest rate differential. Why does the exchange rate respond? Because if our interest rate differential goes up, in other words, if our interest rates go up while interest rates in the rest of the world stay the same, okay, then people want to buy our bonds. Okay? Higher interest rates, higher returns. So they buy our bonds, which makes our currency appreciate because there's demand for our currency. You want to buy South African bonds? If you're in the US, for example, you take your US dollars, you have to buy South African rands in order to purchase the bonds. Okay? But we'll talk about it tomorrow. So when the Reserve Bank lowers the repo rate, short-term interest rates and lending rates fall and the rand depreciates. The quantity of money and the supply of loanable funds increase. The long-term real interest rate falls and the lower real interest rate increases consumption, expenditure and investment. A weaker exchange rate makes South African exports cheaper and imports more costly, thus net exports increase, right? So if the Reserve Bank lowers the repo rate, promotes investment, okay, discourages imports, encourages exports of goods and services, not financial ones, right? Remember, bonds and things are financial assets. We don't include that as GDP. That's not part of CI, X or M. Okay? So, what happens in the loanable fund markets? Demand and supply in the loanable funds determine the real interest rate. In the long run, wait, did I just mix something up here? Sorry, hang on. I think I'm just missing something. Okay, yeah. So the loanable funds market and the long-term interest rate. Demand and supply in the market for loanable funds determines the long-term real interest rate. In the long run, demand and supply in the loanable fund market depend only on real forces, which is to say on savings and investments decisions. But in the short run, the supply of loanable funds is influenced by the supply of bank loans. Changes in the repo rate change the supply of bank loans, which changes the supply of loanable funds, changes the interest rate in the loanable funds market. So we have that discussion shown here as these little blocks, and then we can show what it looks like in a picture as well. So the Reserve Bank lowers, okay, so we're starting with lowers. So the interest rate goes down, the repo rate goes down, other short-term interest rates go down, the quantity of money and the supply of loanable funds increase, okay, which was what we were talking about in your question, which means that the long-term real interest rate falls as well. So in the loanable funds market, interest rates fall, which means consumption, expenditure, investment, and net exports, all of these things increase, which increases aggregate demand, which means real GDP and inflation increase. All of this, however, is a short-run effect, which is the point that is made over here. There's both a long-run effect and a short-run effect. Everything we've described here shifts aggregate demand, which means we have a short-term, a short-run increase in output. But what do we know happens in the long run? If there's an increase in aggregate demand, the response on the supply side is they shift to the left of the short-run aggregate supply curve. When the short-run aggregate supply curve shifts to the left, prices start rising. With an increase in prices, real money supply falls, right? And interest rates start going up, and everything we've spoken about here reverses. And we just end up back at our no change to long-run real variables. Sorry, is everyone happy with that? We've spoken about it many times. We'll speak about it again when we go through the questions. Is everyone kind of tired of that? We can move on. Is that the idea? Okay, cool. What happens to planned expenditure? Well, the ripple effects that follow a change in the repo rate change three components of aggregate expenditure: consumption, investment, and net exports. So we always talk, or the primary interest rate effect that we talk about is the investment interest rate effect. But of course, if consumption is sensitive to interest rate changes, then consumption would also change. If government spending is sensitive to interest rate changes, government spending might change. And then what we are going to see tomorrow is that net exports are also sensitive to interest rates, and they will change as well. But all of these effects are in the same direction, so we don't need to get confused about which way they're going. They all work in the same way. And we just focus mostly on the investment effects. So by changing real GDP and the price level relative to what they would have been without a change in the repo rate, the Reserve Bank influences its ultimate goal, which is the inflation rate. So remember, it's a short-term thing. It influences the inflation rate by changing aggregate demand. Unfortunately, it has very little influence on the supply side of things. Okay? The way that it can influence the supply side of things is just by keeping inflation stable, right? Because then that is good for growth. But it doesn't have a direct effect. It's just, the idea is to keep everything stable so that the supply side can take care of itself. So, how does the Reserve Bank fight a recession? And we've seen this before, we're going to see it again. If inflation is low and the real GDP is below potential GDP, the Reserve Bank can take action that's designed to restore full employment or increase GDP. What happens? Well, in the market for bank reserves, in order to achieve the Reserve Bank's target, which is to increase output, the Reserve Bank can buy securities. When it buys securities, it takes securities, it buys securities, it puts money into the market. It increases money supply, right? It buys securities and supplies just enough reserves. It increases money, it puts money into the system through reserves, which lowers the repo rate. Okay? What happens to banks in the money market? Well, the decline in the cost of funds for banks causes banks to lower their lending rates. And this is actually an annoying statement here. The demand for loans increases. No. Quantity, let's say, first of all, the quantity of bank borrowing, basically, right? So we can say the quantity of bank loans increases. And when we say the quantity of bank loans, remember that the money demand curve, right? Downward sloping money demand. Okay? Downward sloping money demand. Part of that money, right? Money, there's both cash and deposits. Okay? Cash, deposits. So when that downward sloping interest rates, people holding more deposits, okay? On the other side of the bank's balance sheet is the matching assets, which is the loans. So generally, if there are more deposits in the system, there are also more bank loans in the system. That's the downward sloping money demand curve. So people hold more money as deposits, and people have borrowed more money from the bank in terms of loans, because remember, the bank has got a balance sheet that has to balance. It's got more deposits on this side, it's got to have more loans on the other side. Okay? In other words, remember, when the Reserve Bank increases the money supply, the bank's reserves increase. Okay? So the asset side goes up a little bit, reserves increase. Okay? And what does the the bank do with those reserves? It lends them out to people. Okay? So then loans increase as well. And then deposits increase, and we have that multiplier effect with loans and deposits increasing. Right? So really, when it says here the demand for loans increases, that just, to my mind, just confuses things, because there's no shift in the demand curve for loans in like the loanable funds market or some other way, right? There's no shift in the demand curve. So this is just an annoying statement. The quantity of bank loans demanded increases. Okay? I just add in the word here, demanded. So with increased reserves, banks make more loans. These loans lead to deposits, and the supply of money increases via the money multiplier. Okay? So money supply increases. Sorry, let's do that here. Okay, so in our money market, what's happening? So we've got the interest rates, and we've got quantity of, as I said, it's a different pen, so my writing is a little bit different, and it's not really working so well here, but anyway. Okay, with an increase in the money supply, we end up holding more money, right? The quantity of money held increases. The quantity of money supplied increases. And the interest rate decreases. That's right. So with an increase in reserves, the banks make more loans. These loans lead to more deposits. The supply of money increases through this money multiplier process. Deposits increase. Okay? And on the other side, loans increase as well. What happens in the loanable funds market? Well, when banks create money, they make loans. In the long run, an increase in the supply of bank loans is matched by a rise in the price level, and the quantity of real loans is unchanged. Okay, so this is in the long run. But in the in the long run. But in the short run, banks increase loans. In the short run, there is an increase in the supply of loanable funds. There's more money available for people to borrow, which is why I say when it says here demand, there's an increase in demand. That's really misleading. It's not the demand side that's affected here. In the loanable funds market, there's an increase in the supply of loanable funds. Yeah? With an increase in the supply of loanable funds, quantity of funds borrowed and quantity of funds loaned increases, and interest rates decrease. Right? And that's the short run effect. There was an increase in the supply of loans. So the short run, increase in the supply of bank loans. But in the long run, remember what happens? Price level increases, real money supply actually decreases. That decrease in the real money supply makes the available loanable funds decrease. In other words, there's a shift back to the left in the supply of loanable funds. So the real interest rate ultimately doesn't change, which is what we end up seeing. So there's a long run effect, but in the short run, with a sticky price level, an increase in the supply of bank loans increases the supply of real loanable funds. Okay? And then the market for real GDP, the increase in the supply of loans and the decrease in the real interest rate increase aggregate planned expenditure. So here we have the summary of our course without the labor market. Yeah? You got monetary policy, so decrease in interest rates, repo rates, right, and open market operations by the banks, by the Reserve Bank. Increases money supply, increases supply of loanable funds, shifts aggregate demand. So here we have monetary policy reacting to a recession and trying to promote output growth. Cool? Great. And then obviously when the Reserve Bank fights inflation, it's going to be, I'm not going to go through it again, it's going to be the opposite of everything else. Everything that we just spoken about. So ultimately, though, whatever happens with monetary policy, it's kind of difficult to predict, because at the end of the day, there's a very loose link between the repo rate and spending in the long run, because we've seen that the Reserve Bank's monetary policy, it's really just targeted at short-run effects, right? But reacting in the short run, we can do something, and then we don't know necessarily if that would then change people's perceptions about things. In other words, we in that ASAD model, we can say, oh, it's going to do these things, right? But what happens if it also changes people's expectations, for example? What happens if it also influences other stuff? Then it can do changes that we just don't really know about, right? It's very tricky to actually get this whole process right. And another problem with monetary policy is that there are also time lags. The monetary policy transmission process tends to be about 18 months in advance. So the Reserve Bank acts now. The full effect of those changes, you only see them in 18 months' time, right? You start seeing them in 6 months. You start seeing them a bit more in 12 months, but it's like the full effect is 18 months. So the Reserve Bank wants to target inflation. What it really has to target is inflation in 18 months' time. That's why communication is so important. And I don't think the South African Reserve Bank is very good at it, but that's my personal opinion. Of course, we are used to inflation targeting in the South African economy, but that's just one kind of monetary policy strategy. There are alternatives to the current methods of conducting monetary policy, and these include a monetary base instrument rule, or a money targeting rule, or an exchange rate targeting rule, and we will look at each of those here. But there are two essentially within these. These are all different types of methods that fall within two basic strategies. So you can have an instrument rule strategy or a targeting rule strategy. So we do inflation targeting. That would be a targeting rule strategy, right? Exchange rate targeting rule would be a targeting rule of the exchange rate as opposed to inflation. Right? Or if you target the monetary base, that's another targeting rule. Okay? We do inflation targeting. And then you also have something called an instrument rule. So an instrument rule, as an example, would be something like the Taylor rule. So the Taylor rule says the instrument that we're going to use is interest rates. Okay? So it sounds kind of like inflation targeting. But the rule would look something like the interest rate. What we're going to do is we're going to say the interest rate should be, there's some kind of long run equilibrium interest rate. Call it R star, right? Whatever it is. And we're going to say that we're going to keep the interest rate at that long run interest rate. Okay? It's kind of a long run equilibrium level interest rate. But we will adjust it if, for example, there are, let's say our inflation is higher than what the long-run equilibrium inflation level should be. If inflation is above what it should be, then take the long-run interest rate, let's say it's 2%, right? That doesn't really look like a 2%, and then we add some coefficient on whatever the gap in inflation is. So let's say the inflation rate is 1% higher than what we want, than the long-run equilibrium. And let's say that we make this coefficient 100, like alpha, we make it 1. Then what should our interest rate be now 2% plus 1%. So make the interest rate now 3%. And in the Taylor rule, it's not just if there's an inflationary gap, but also what if there is an output gap? If output is greater than equilibrium long run full employment output. Okay? So let's say inflation is above what it should be, okay? And output is above what it should be. Let's say we are above, I've just got here Y, but it's actually a percentage measure. Let's say we're 1% above full employment. And again, let's make beta 1 just to make our lives easy. Then what should our interest rate be? It should be 2% plus 1% plus 1% makes 4%. In other words, raise the interest rates above the long run equilibrium level because inflation is greater than the long run level and output is greater than the long run level. If inflation and output are above our full employment level, we've got a positive output gap. We've got an inflationary gap. So what should you do with an inflationary gap? You should raise interest rates, right? That's what this instrument rule is. So the instrument here is the interest rate, and this is the rule. The alternative is what we have, which is inflation targeting. So inflation targeting says, cool, we're going to have some instrument. The instrument happens to also be interest rates. And what we want to do is we want to say, what do we think inflation is going to be? And then change the interest rate now to hit that inflation target. So here you see that you don't have a target for inflation. You just have a long-run equilibrium level. And you have a long-run equilibrium level for the interest rate. And you just adjust it if you move away from it. Whereas inflation targeting just says choose some inflation rate and target that rate. Right? And then you can get a monetary base instrument rule, which is, you can read about it, but basically the same sort of thing. You just choose some, like, how much money should we have? Right. Make sure we always have that much money. Right? What quantity of money? Make sure that's what we have. Or you can have a money targeting rule. So you can choose a target for the amount of money and then say, cool, what do we think is going to be happening? How do we then adjust interest rates to make sure we hit that monetary target, for example? Or you can have an exchange rate targeting rule, and that's what China did for a long time. They basically had a peg. So they said the Chinese yuan must always be trade at this exchange rate to the dollar. Okay? And then we basically buy or sell dollars to make sure that the exchange rate is always equal to that exchange rate. And you buy or sell dollars by, basically injecting money into foreign exchange markets or taking money out of foreign exchange markets, which is the same way as injecting money basically into not necessarily your economy, but the global economy. And then that will have potentially inflationary effects. But what you're targeting is not inflation. What you're targeting is exchange rate. And that is that for chapter 31. Perfect. Tomorrow, chapter 26. And that will be the final roll call. A little heart flutter. Okay, see you tomorrow.